You see, we were all new to television in those days, and we did not know what a thing we had, what a powerful medium that we were working with.
Instead of asking what party will bring prices down, why not ask what party put prices up? Then vote for a change.
It was the first time that television had ever been used to try it to help a president be elected.
In politics, you have a one-day sale. You have every customer allowed in the store for 1 or 2 minutes on that day.
Why am I confused? Who am I measuring McGovern against? Gut feeling, my gut feeling. McGovern. His hand voted for Kennedy.
And you have to sell a majority or plurality of the market, or you are out of business. You might say the three parties are ABC, NBC, and CBS.
In keeping with Chevron's tradition of service throughout the 20th century, the people of Chevron bring you this program in support of public television.
I'm Bill Moyers. Have you ever stopped to think when you pulled that lever, what influenced your vote? What made you choose one presidential candidate over another? What did you know about your choice, and how did you know it? There was a time when everything we knew about the men who would be president, we learned from word of mouth. Party faithful spread the word at political rallies, torchlight parades, barbecues, and even tea parties. And partisan papers, without any tribute to journalistic standards, lavished eloquent adjectives on their favorites and profaned the opposition. If you were lucky as time moved on, you might have had a chance to hear the candidate himself as he whistle-stopped through town. But things have certainly changed since the turn of this century, when William McKinley sat on his front porch in Canton, Ohio, and expected the voters to come by to see him in person. Today, much of what we know about the candidate we get directly from the screen in front of you. No single force has changed American politics more than this little box. And the part of the change that's our subject in this broadcast is the television commercial. It's given us the 30-second president who speaks by the skill and with the images of the ad men and women who make the spots that urge us to buy this or that or do this or do that. The first person to join the medium and the candidate became one of the giants of American advertising. The same man who sold you this.
The administration has spent many billions of dollars for national defense. Yet today, we haven't enough tanks for the fighting in Korea.
Also sold you this.
Take Anacin for fast, fast, fast relief.
Now watch what happens when I use Rolade's miracle ingredient. All the acid here is taken care of.
M&M's milk chocolate melts in your mouth, not in your hand.
His name was Rosser Reeves.
Television hit after World War II. Everyone in the advertising business was absolutely terrified. No one knew how to handle it. No one had ever written advertising for television. No one knew what the techniques were, what the principles were. It was almost impossible to tell the difference between a good and a bad commercial. And it was a very exciting era, naturally, because we were discovering. I mean, we were all Christopher Columbuses, you see.
Rosser Reeves came to fame and fortune on Madison Avenue as the dean of the Hammer at Home School of Advertising. He had a talent for turning television into a merchandise mart and himself into a multimillionaire. As I learned in this interview shortly before his death, Rosser Reeves figured the television audience was, well, sort of an island waiting to be invaded.
We began to discover that with very small sums of money, we could register what we call penetration into the brains of 60, 70, 80% of all the people in the United States.
Fast, fast, fast relief.
Did that scare you?
Well, it frightened. We realized that we had a demon, you know, I mean, by the hands, you know, in our hands. It was a terrifying and exhilarating statistic to us.
Exhilarating?
Well, of course. I mean, we were in a competitive business. And who can do this best is the man that gets the business.
Let's take some of your most successful campaigns. Anacin.
Well, Anacin is a very famous headache remedy that's been around for many, many years. And the Anacin commercial was probably the most outstanding example of all time of real hard sell.
Oh, I remember it. I remember from my youth, you know, when headaches strike, what do doctors do?
What do doctors do when headache strikes?
Before you take anything for headache, stop. Ask yourself, what do doctors recommend?
What do doctors recommend for headache pain?
Here is your answer. 3 out of 4 doctors recommend the ingredients in Anacin. You see, doctors know. When headache strikes, pain mounts up. You feel dull, depressed. Tension puts nerves on edge. Now, aspirin has only one pain reliever. Add buffering, you still get only one. But Anacin is like a doctor's prescription. That is a combination of ingredients to 1, relieve pain. 2, help overcome that depressed feeling. 3, calm jittery nerves.
When it ran, what happened?
Sales went through the roof.
Were you surprised?
Yes, I think I was, because you see, we were all new to television in those days, and we did not know what a thing we had, what a powerful medium that we were working with.
And that was evidence.
Oh, indeed it was. It was evident to us. We were in packaged goods, and we knew almost instantly when things were working, because we could see the goods move right off the shelves. And when we discovered the power of television, we just dropped everything else and went for TV.
You get fast relief from pain, fight depression, calm jittery nerves.
What's very interesting to me, another side of that coin, was the fact that it was perhaps the most hated commercial on the air at the time. The Prince of Hard Sell, they called me. People saw it over and over and over again. The hammers in the heads, the spark coil jumping. It was a commercial that almost induced the headache that it was supposed to cure. Very interesting point, though, in advertising, that what the public thinks is an unpopular commercial has no correlation at all with the sales.
How do you explain that?
I can't explain it. It's just that the commercial is an instrument to get people to remember your advertising.
Well, you did with this one, because even now I can see and hear.
Take Anacin for fast relief.
Those commercials haven't run in years, and you still remember them.
Oh, I do.
That's the name of the game.
You make it sound so simple.
Well, it is very simple, in my opinion. I think most advertising men, they get tangled in their own underwear. You know, you have to be terribly simplistic.
M&M's milk chocolate melts in your mouth, not in your hand.
You know how many illiterates we have in the United States? People that do not have the verbal skills, who can't read, people that speak other languages.
This Bic pen, placed in a high-speed drill.
You have to take what the product has, reduce it to a few essentials that are meaningful to them.
That burning sensation.
Put it in a memorable television commercial.
Bic doesn't clog.
And then spend the money. It's a very simple business.
I feel great.
All right, let's take one of your most famous products, Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh, you can hardly include him as packaged goods, can you?
Well, what was the philosophy behind the Eisenhower ads? How did you decide to package the general?
Well, I didn't try to package the general. I did not try to put any words in the general's mouth. But the general was a singularly inept speaker. I remember that he had made a big speech in Philadelphia. I went to Philadelphia and heard the speech, and I think he covered 27 different points. And the next morning I had my research crew there, and I discovered that nobody knew what the general had said. He was all over the lot. And so we tried to find out what Eisenhower really stood for. You can't sell 27 things at all. So we selected 3. I wanted to select 1. The Republican National Committee wanted 3. And we picked those three: corruption in Washington, the higher taxes, and so on and so forth. He was magnificent, did it all in one day, 44th Street at Transfilm Studios. We thought he would get through 4 commercials in the day, and he cut 35 or 40 in one day.
Did he memorize them?
We had some of the highest priced art directors in the world who were down on the all fours lettering it on cards, and the general would read it once. He was a very fast study, and he played it perfectly.
Eisenhower answers America.
General, both parties talk about bringing down food prices. How do we know which party to believe?
Well, instead of asking what party will bring prices down, why not ask what party put prices up? Then vote for a change.
You know what things cost today. High prices are just driving me crazy.
Yes, my Mamie gets after me about the high cost of living. It's another reason why I say it's time for a change. Time to get back to an honest dollar and an honest dollar's worth. Eisenhower answers America.
I'm a veteran, General. What's wrong down in Washington? Graft, scandal, headlines. How can you fix it?
Here's how. By your votes, we'll get rid of the people who are too small for their jobs, too big for their britches, too long in power.
And at the end, absolutely exhausted, we were going back to the Commodore Hotel to have a drink. He mopped his brow and says, "Think that an old soldier should come to this."
Didn't you record Eisenhower's answers and then bring in people to ask the questions after they'd been recorded?
Well, as the commercials were written, and the general recorded the answers before we found the people to ask the questions. Yes, that is quite correct.
Eisenhower answers America.
General, if war comes, is this country really ready?
It is not. The administration has spent many billions for national defense. Yet today, we haven't enough planes for the fighting in Korea. It's time for a change.
Where'd you get the people?
The people were picked up, we wanted people from all around the country, and I think they were taken from tours of Radio City.
Tours of Radio City?
That's correct.
You asked them, are you a farmer? Are you a housewife?
Are you a farmer? And are you interested in Eisenhower? What questions would you ask? And then we'd say, would you ask that question? It was photographed on a separate day, and I don't see any great harm in that, do you?
It was a new technique.
It was the first time that television had ever been used to try it to help a president be elected.
Do you think it denigrated politics?
No. They were very simplistic commercials. They look almost naive in terms of modern television techniques.
And yet a great howl went up about merchandising the presidency.
Well, stop and think. Who remembers? If you remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address, people only remember one thing in it. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. There in the middle of an inaugural address was a 5-second spot, and that's all people remember. If you take all of Winston Churchill's great lines, you'll never have so many, owed so much to so few. Does anybody remember the speech in which that was embedded like a little fly in amber? It was a spot. It came out. It's what lingered in the minds of the hearers and in the press. So I simply decided that if that was what democracy is all about, why not tell more people? And I still defend the technique.
But they accused you of introducing the techniques of Madison Avenue into national politics.
It was inevitable that it had to happen. I was merely the first one that did it.
Ike for president, 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 Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
In addition to an advertising budget 10 times bigger than the Democrats, Eisenhower had animation from the Disney studios and the music of Irving Berlin.
The man from Abilene, out of the heartland of America, out of this small frame house in Abilene, Kansas, came a man, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Through the crucial hour of historic D-Day, he brought us to the triumphant peace of VE Day. Now another crucial hour in our history. The nation, haunted by the stalemate in Korea, looks to Eisenhower.
The general who led the Allies to victory in World War II appealed to voters grown weary now of war in Korea and politicians in Washington. His ads offered a commander-in-chief who wouldn't need on-the-job training. He'd already been a leader of men.
I'd rather
with a hole in his shoe than a hole in everything he says. I'd rather have a man who knows what to do when he gets to be the prez. I love the governor of Illinois. He is the gov that brings the dove of peace and joy.
The Democrats had Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, but alas, they didn't have the music of Irving Berlin. Stevenson preferred his own lyrics.
We have done what doubters of democracy thought a democracy could not do. We have yielded neither to the hotheads who wanted to extend the war, nor to the weak-kneed who wanted to quit when the going was tough.
Stevenson didn't like television or Madison Avenue slogans. He liked to make speeches and puns. Unfortunately for him, the man who said, "Eggheads of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your yolks," had to defend an incumbent Democratic administration that had egg on its face.
Washington, 1952, home of the top-to-bottom mess. Today, all over America, patriotic men and women are jarred by the constant disclosures of graft and bribery in the Washington administration. Shocked by tales of influence peddling.
But the trouble with calling the other fellow a skunk is that sometimes the wind changes.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned.
The Republican attack on Democratic corruption almost backfired when Democrats spread stories of a secret trust fund set up for Ike's running mate, Richard Nixon. Party leaders pressured Nixon to resign. Instead, he took his case directly to the voters in a speech broadcast live right after the popular Milton Berle show. The Checkers speech, as it came to be known, got the biggest audience of the campaign and saved Nixon's political career.
I love my country. And I think my country is in danger. And I think the only man that can save America at this time is the man that's running for president on my ticket, Dwight Eisenhower.
Guess where we are going, travel day and night for President Adelaide, go the other way, we'll all go with
Ike clinched the election with a last-minute promise to go to Korea, although he never explained what he would do when he got there.
We'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
The Republicans were back in the White House for the first time in 20 years.
The Democratic National Committee presents another visit with the man from Libertyville. Here at the end of this lane, on a farm about 4 miles from Libertyville, lives Adlai E. Stevenson of Illinois.
Take one, track 43.
Now, here's the governor.
In 1956, the Democrats tried to fight the popular man from Abilene with the man from Libertyville. This time, Adlai Stevenson would be just plain folks. He'd even changed his opinion about television, and he told us so.
But you know, it's amazing how many things there are in television that you don't see. But I confess I rather like it. It's wonderful how sitting right here in my own library, thanks to television, I can talk to millions of people that I couldn't reach any other way.
The ads portrayed Stevenson and his running mate, Estes Kefauver, as simple country farmers, standing up for their neighbors.
Most of the key men in the Eisenhower administration are big industrialists. They know big business. They know how to advertise their products. They know even how to advertise their political products. But they don't know much about the farmer's problem.
Meanwhile, Eisenhower's neighbors were speaking up for him.
I always stop when I reach this particular spot. Look over there at that house, where you see the lighted windows. A neighbor of mine lives there. Yep, Dwight D. Eisenhower. A man with the most important job in the world today. What do you suppose he's thinking about over there?
International crises in Hungary and Suez. That's what the president had on his mind. His ads told us he was too busy for politics as usual. Just enjoy your prosperity, they said, while Ike tends the store. And don't forget, he had gone to Korea.
But 4 years ago, it was a different story. 4 years ago, many of our young men were on Heartbreak Ridge in Korea. And that was no game. But what do you say? Are you willing to bet everything you love and hold dear that Stevenson can also keep us out of war? Are you that sure of it?
Eisenhower was so popular that the frustrated Democrats tried to chip away at his pedestal with the new blunt instrument of the negative commercial. They used words written for Ike 4 years earlier by Rosser Reeves.
How's that again, General? During the 1952 campaign, General Eisenhower promised a great crusade.
Too many politicians have sold their ideals of honesty down the Potomac. We must bring back integrity and thrift to Washington.
How's that again, General?
We must bring back integrity and thrift to Washington.
This is Estes Kefauver. That was another promise the general didn't keep.
It didn't work. Many people resented the attacks on their president. So Democrats went after the man who might become president. Eisenhower had suffered a heart attack, and the Democrats asked,
"Nervous about Nixon? President Nixon? Vote Democratic. The party for you, not just the few."
Meanwhile, the philosopher from Libertyville was still trying to prove that he was just one of us.
The Stevensons are returning now from a shopping trip in Libertyville. The governor is helping with the groceries.
Now, most of us don't go grocery shopping in a suit and tie. And doesn't he know the butter is melting? Governor, oh, Governor, don't look now, Governor, but...
Oh, man.
You were a big help, Doug.
Oh, I forgot. I forgot to deliver the groceries and made a speech instead.
Who will you vote for? What's your decision? What do you say?
Me? I like Ike.
Did they like Ike? Once again, he walloped Adlai Stevenson. And after the election, Stevenson proposed that in the future, presidential candidates be given free television time. You can hardly blame him. The Republicans had outspent him at every turn of the dial. Furthermore, Stevenson couldn't get the best guns for hire on Madison Avenue to work for him because of their fear of offending their big business clients. By 1960, 9 out of 10 American homes had television sets, so the need for a more level playing field became more apparent than ever, at least to those on the lower end of it. The ad men were also beginning to fear being branded the new villains of politics and of being on the wrong side of the outcome if a fickle public changed its mind. So they started returning phone calls from Democrats. And the networks, well, they made free airtime available for presidential debates. So politics was ready to move to a brand new stage. You're looking at it right now. He had been considered by many Democrats as too young, too rich, and in too much of a hurry. Television helped him overcome the obstacles, if not the doubts. His spots showed him exchanging views with Americans of all stripes, from classrooms to coal mines. Even the most controversial issue, the one that threatened to cost him the most, he turned to his advantage with ads in which he stood before Protestant audiences to answer questions about his religion.
The question is whether I think that if I were elected president, I would be divided between two loyalties, my church and my state. There is no article of my faith that would in any way inhibit. I think it encourages the meeting of my oath of office.
Kennedy's opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, did not use television as much in his campaign. Nixon's ad stressed his experience in foreign affairs. Still photographs conveyed a heroic image of the candidate.
Mr. Nixon, what is the truth about our ability to fight the growing menace of communism?
Well, first, we must recognize communism for what it is.
Against the advice of his television experts, Nixon opted for the direct approach in his spots, in part because he thought the public would be turned off by a slick campaign.
That America won't stand for being pushed around anywhere in the world. When Mr. Khrushchev says our grandchildren will live under communism, we must answer his grandchildren will live in freedom.
Kennedy countered with reminders of anti-American demonstrations that occurred when Nixon traveled abroad.
If you believe America's world prestige has gone downhill in these 8 Republican years, vote Kennedy for president.
Kennedy's most effective spot, one used over and over, simply quoted President Eisenhower, who was asked by a reporter to name one major idea of Richard Nixon's that Ike had adopted. Just one.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember because...
Ike's off-the-cuff remark damaged Nixon, but the vice president hurt himself even more in what came to be known as the Great Debate.
Here are some revealing excerpts from the Great Debate.
Well, now let's look at these bills that the vice president suggests were too extreme. One was a bill for $1.25 an hour for anyone.
Appearances were everything. Radio audiences thought Nixon had won the debate, but to TV audiences he seemed nervous and uncomfortable. He had only recently been in the hospital recovering from an illness, and his refusal to wear makeup didn't help his appearance. Kennedy's ad men made the most of it. Spots featuring a shifty-eyed, scowling Nixon appeared right up to Election Day.
Americans want to move ahead with new leadership. Let's elect John F. Kennedy president.
And they did, by just over 100,000 votes.
I know what kind of a dream Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman and John F. Kennedy would dream if they were here tonight.
Lyndon Johnson was the president in 1964, and his opponent did what challengers usually do. He ran against that mess in Washington.
Graft. Swindles. Juvenile delinquency. Hear what Barry Goldwater has to say about our lack of moral leadership.
We, as a nation, are not far from the kind of moral decay that has brought on the fall of other nations and people.
In a television campaign that relied on half-hour speeches, Barry Goldwater painted a civilization on the verge of collapse, morally bankrupt at home, and threatened by a creeping communist menace abroad. Goldwater called for action.
I want American kids to grow up as Americans, and they will, if we have the guts to make our intentions clear. So clear they don't
But the
need
central issue of the campaign, exploited by the Democrats, soon became Barry Goldwater's own intentions.
In your heart, you know he's right.
Democratic spots portrayed Goldwater as too far to the right of mainstream America. Their ammunition had been handed them by a bitterly divided Republican Party.
I don't know just why they wanted to call this a confession. I certainly don't feel guilty about being a Republican.
Lyndon Johnson was asked if he shouldn't label Goldwater an extremist. No, said the president. Moderate Republicans had done that for him.
I voted for Dwight Eisenhower the first time I ever voted. I voted for Nixon the last time. But when we come to Senator Goldwater, now it seems to me we're up against a very different kind of a man.
Barry Goldwater said, "Sometimes I think this country would be better off if we could just saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea."
Even his running mate, William Miller, admits that Senator Goldwater's voluntary plan would destroy your Social Security.
But the president did want to remind voters that Senator Goldwater had talked loosely about tactical nuclear weapons. After Goldwater had cracked that maybe we ought to lob one into the men's room of the Kremlin, bumper stickers said, "In your heart, you know he might." This spot never even mentioned Goldwater by name, but proved to be one of the most controversial in the history of advertising.
7, 6, 6, 8, 9, 9.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I'm Ronald Reagan. Every American should hear what Barry Goldwater really has to say, not what a bunch of distorters of the truth would have you believe.
The actor Ronald Reagan came riding to Barry Goldwater's defense in one of his first nationally televised speeches. But neither he nor other Republicans could save the Goldwater campaign.
Our opponents are referring to us as warmongers.
Well, Barry, in my mind, this is actual Tommy rot.
Even the beloved Ike couldn't help. Johnson won by a landslide. 1964 was some year in the evolution of political advertising. I know because I was in the middle of it. Seems a long time ago now, 1964. I was a young man up from Texas, a son of the New Deal, working for someone, Lyndon Johnson, who himself, 20 years earlier, had said that FDR was like a second daddy to him. I was a special assistant at the White House, and one of my jobs that year was to be a liaison for the president to the people who had been hired to create the advertising for the campaign. That was the agency of Doyle Dane Bernbach. They were famous for the Volkswagen campaign. Remember that marvelous slogan, "Think Small." They also did the Avis campaign, "We Try Harder." They were departing from the hard sell strategy of Rosser Reeves. And one of the men to whom they turned, I never met him, by the way, until a year or so ago, was a brilliant young fellow named Tony Schwartz. He was among the first of a new class of players in presidential politics, the media specialist. It's a long way from the torchlight parade of the last century to Tony Schwartz.
Have you thought about the vice presidential candidates?
For 20 years, scores of politicians have made the pilgrimage to this windowless sanctuary of sound in Midtown Manhattan. Here, Tony Schwartz has created some of the most effective commercials for Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, and Jimmy Carter, not to mention Coca-Cola and Alka-Seltzer. Tony Schwartz began his career as an artist, but in the 1950s he began to experiment with tape recorders and launched a new career that would establish him as the Wizard of Sound. In his commercials, Schwartz aims at the seat of emotion far within the subconscious. He doesn't like the label soft sell that has been used to describe his work. This is no soft sell, says Tony Schwartz. It's deep sell. The Daisy spot is perhaps the best example of Schwartz's emotional deep sell. It only aired once in that campaign, and yet it is still talked and written about all these years later. Now, what does that commercial do?
This commercial is really a Rorschach pattern. Reminds me very much of the person who will go to a psychologist and be shown the ink blots and say to the psychologist, "Doctor, I didn't come here to be shown dirty pictures." And
the dirty pictures being in
their mind.
In their mind.
Now, the dirty thing or negative thing, if anything, was Goldwater wanting to use or seeing as an option the use of tactical atomic weapons. People didn't hear the word tactical. They just heard Goldwater atomic weapons, Johnson no atomic weapons.
Or didn't this commercial exploit the seeming simplicity of Goldwater's statement?
Yes.
I remember that when it aired, the White House switchboard was jammed with calls. Many of the president's own friends got through to him. He called me and said, "What in the expletive deleted is going on here?" I said, "It seemed to me that you did what you wanted to do, which was to remind people of what Barry Goldwater had been saying about atomic weapons." And there was a long pause on the phone, and he said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." Was it unfair?
I don't think so at all. I think it probably was right on target.
What did it do?
It made people aware of this basic difference, and it really showed the underlying fear that people had of atomic warfare. And I think Goldwater should have said the next morning that this commercial should be the theme of the presidential campaign, and I'd like to pay for half of its running. And that is, how do we prevent atomic warfare in our day and age? He could have killed that whole commercial that way, I think.
And he didn't.
And he didn't.
Instead, he reacted.
It fit. His saying foul says it fits. That's me they're talking about. We didn't say it, he said it.
Rosser Reeves said of commercials, "We realized we had a demon on our hands." Do you agree with that?
I came into it when it was already here, so I didn't see it as a demon, but I feel that it's probably one of the most important things in changing our lives, in restructuring our lives.
In what way?
I think that television has restructured the way we shop, the way we learn, the way we entertain ourselves. Just all the important things in our life have been restructured by television.
Has it restructured politics?
Absolutely. We find that the political parties are no longer the major communications force in politics. The networks are. You might say the three parties are ABC, NBC, and CBS.
What has it done, Tony, to the selling of presidents and political candidates?
I don't use, and I don't like the term selling the candidate. I don't use advertising techniques to, quote, sell candidates. Many people say you shouldn't sell candidates the way you sell soap.
Right.
I wouldn't even sell soap the way they sell soap. They try to throw things at the consumer. They use the consumer as a target. And I use the consumer or the voter as a workforce.
A workforce?
Yes. And that's the difference between TV commercials and print. They are emotional. You react to them. You hear and see things and react to them rather than go through the process of reading and thinking in a different ways. For instance, if I were to say to you, Mary had a little
lamb,
or for the rest of your
life.
Right. These are things that are stored in your mind from your experience in life, and I can evoke them with what I say. And that's where you become workforce in the process.
I become your workforce.
That's right. I use polling to find out what's in your mind in relation to the things we're going to talk about. We test before we do commercials. The advertising community likes to test their commercials. I find no value to it. We don't test the commercials, we test the public and see whether, after we've run the commercials, whether the attitudes they have changed. If they have, then the commercials are working.
Well, that newspaper clipping on your wall over there says, snaring votes means hitting emotions. That's what it is.
That's right.
And how do you decide how to hit those emotions?
Up on the wall there, you can see those records. I've been recording the people and life of New York for 40 years. So I've had experience of how people react. I even did an interesting thing. I performed in a nightclub for 5 or 6 years on Saturday nights, just playing tapes of people. And I found how people reacted to people. I would play children, I would play taxi drivers.
So what did you learn from this that you brought into politics?
I learned what people reacted to. I learned how people reacted to hearing people and to sound.
This Tony Schwartz ad for Hubert Humphrey in 1968 used 30 separate instruments to create this noise, which he calls the sound of a headache. George McGovern decided not to use this 1972 spot that combined the eerie sound of jets with this wrenching image from television news. Like the Daisy commercial, the opponent's name is never mentioned. The only words were spoken by Schwartz's 5-year-old son.
Does a president know that planes bomb children?
People say, how can you educate the public about issues with commercials? The fascinating thing is that's not the function of commercials. You or our listeners have their opinion about all the issues. You know, if I were to say to you, do you have an opinion about the death penalty? You'd say yes or no. Sure. You have it one way. About abortion, about the economy, you have your position on that. The education that takes place in commercials is to find out what the candidate's position is. Does he feel the same way I do about these things? And that's what we tried to do. We tried to communicate the candidate's feelings about things that people feel deeply about. In an interesting way, we find that politics is probably the most task-oriented area of advertising that ever existed.
Task-oriented?
Yes. In product selling, you can go up 3% a year and be happy. You can lose 3% a year and be happy. But in politics, you have a one-day sale. You have if you put it in advertising terms, you have every customer allowed in the store for 1 or 2 minutes on that day, and you have to sell a majority or plurality of the market, or you are out of business.
In 1968, there was no incumbent running for re-election. President Johnson retired over the stalemate in Vietnam, and the race was between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. This time it was the Democrats who fought openly at their convention, forcing Humphrey to lead a divided party. Outside, demonstrators clashed with Chicago police. These scenes became part of the network's campaign coverage. In the public mind, Vice President Humphrey shared the blame for the war in Vietnam, giving the Republicans an issue they exploited in spots like this one.
This time, vote like your whole world depended on it.
The Vice President of the United States. We have seen the terrible results of violence in this country. It would be intolerable if a handful of violent people, and that is what it is, just a handful, could harden us against needed change. I've seen
At first, Humphrey's television spots pictured a man on the defensive. Instead of counterattacking, he stressed his accomplishments.
The 1964 Civil Rights Act, Medicare, the Job Corps, Project Head Start. Get behind the man behind them all. Hubert H. Humphrey for president.
Never has so much power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all
Nixon hammered at the Vietnam issue with emotional ads and an attractive promise.
I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
Some men will tell you anything. Mr. Nixon pledges he'll end the war in Vietnam. But Spiro Agnew says Nixon has no plan.
Trailing badly, the Democrats changed their advertising. They commissioned Tony Schwartz to produce a series of negative commercials attacking Nixon directly. Humphrey began to close the gap.
Some men will tell you anything to get the job, while other men are interested in the truth.
But it was too little, too late. Humphrey lost by less than 1% of the vote. You also did a commercial in that campaign about Agnew as vice president. What did your research show about him?
The research showed that Agnew as a potential president was a joke.
In the before the campaign actually began?
Yes.
And you had to play on that.
Yes, I mean, it showed that people didn't think of him as a meaningful candidate for vice president.
Because he wasn't qualified to be president.
That's right.
Well, let's see how you use that.
Okay.
It's still funny, but I remember Bill Sapphire in the New York Times snarling that was the most distasteful, unfair, and insulting commercial ever on television since the Daisy commercial. Mm-hmm. Did that bother you?
No.
So what are you trying to do there?
I'm trying to say that you've got to think carefully of the team, that they're both important. Because if this guy dies, we could be left with a real lemon.
How do you decide where to hit an opponent?
Based on our research, what research shows, how people feel. If research would show that the hit is unbelievable, you shouldn't do it and wouldn't do it.
You're trying to make a true case against your opponent.
That's right. I had a situation come up in the McGovern campaign.
1972.
When Larry O'Brien came to me at the end of the campaign and said, I've just got to show them that we could have done some good commercials, because there are 4 ways people can vote, for or against either candidate. And Larry O'Brien and I felt more votes could be gotten against Nixon than for McGovern.
Were you with the 3rd Marines up there?
No, I was with the Americal Division.
Oh, yeah. I had a son-in-law at Shulai.
Most of them were still safe in grade school when this man first spoke out against the war.
George McGovern's ad stressed his early opposition to the Vietnam War. Here, surrounded by veterans, he asked for their support.
I love the United States, but I love it enough so I want to see some changes made.
McGovern, right from the start.
The McGovern Defense Plan. He would cut the Marines by 1/3.
While McGovern talked about America, Nixon talked about McGovern.
Senator Hubert Humphrey had this to say about the McGovern proposal. It's cutting into the very security of this country. President Nixon doesn't believe we should play games with our national security. He believes in a strong America, to negotiate for peace from strength.
And you're saying that if he had gotten people to think about voting against Nixon, he might have done better than the one state he carried?
Exactly. And I did 5 commercials for McGovern that Larry O'Brien asked me to do. They ran only 2 of them. This was one that got on.
Well, either way, it won't be a disaster. What am I looking for? I mean, so I'll vote for Nixon. Why rock the boat? I'm not crazy about it. Never was. I gotta decide, though. I gotta make up my mind. I'm not crazy about McGovern either. I don't have that much time. I can't keep people waiting. The fellas are voting Nixon. They expect me to vote for him, too. Me vote for Nixon. My father'd roll over in his grave. The fellas say they are. I don't know. Maybe they're not. Crime? I don't feel safe. Price is up. Got a gut feeling. Don't vote for Nixon. Why am I confused? Who am I measuring McGovern against? Gut feeling. My gut feeling. McGovern. This hand voted for Kennedy. I mean, it's just possible. McGovern's straight. Maybe he can. That's the way.
Well, now, what's the principle of that ad?
Surfacing this confusion that people had, giving them permission to have it. I actually read a piece in the Times that people were confused about how could they vote for Nixon with all their memories about him and the fact that they had voted for Democrats all along. This was pulling a lot of those deep strings of the tradition of voting Democrat, of this hand voted for Kennedy. You know, how could it vote for that character? It could evoke a lot of feelings that people had within them. They could feel those are the things that are going on in my mind also.
What I see and hear deals more with the emotions than what I read.
That's right. We are in the business of using PR in a new manner, not in the old print terms of press relations. We are using PR as people's reactions, personal retrieval of your feelings and associations, PR, people's recall of their experiences, PR, planning reactions. That's our whole new business. It's a PR business, planning reactions.
But isn't it manipulating people to, in effect, tell them what they're feeling instead of telling them what they need to know to vote?
I use a word, not manipulation, I say partipulation.
Partipulation?
You have to participate in your own manipulation in that you're bringing things to your manipulation. If you don't want to participate in it, you could turn off the commercial, you could, turn it out, but there are things that get into you, and that's the participation.
Shouldn't the purpose of a spot be to let you know what a candidate will do about a problem rather than how he feels about a problem?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because if I were to bring 5 people in here, into this room, to tell us how to deal with the high cost of living, or how to deal with the question of inflation, or the national debt, and we had each one of those people speak for a half hour, and I said, which one do you think is right? You'd have a hard job knowing who's right. We don't know those things. No one has had experience with the answers to our problems. Everyone has had experience with the problems. And they will tend to believe that if a man is equipped for the job and he feels as deeply as they do about something, they will tend to feel he'll do the right thing.
I'm feeling good about America, and I feel it everywhere I go. I'm feeling good about America, and I feel you ought to know.
Yes, Ford has made me feel proud to be an American. I think he's done a wonderful job for America.
I'm feeling good about America. I'm feeling good about me.
If you were to take a candidate and let him stand on the most crowded corner in the world and shake hands with one person every 10 seconds, he couldn't shake hands in the whole campaign with a fraction of the people that will see one commercial where he can talk to them in their home directly and in a very modest way tell them something for 30 seconds or 60 seconds as opposed to shaking hands and not saying anything for 10 seconds.
I want a chance to give back to you the security and the hopes for tomorrow that inflation is stealing from you. With your help, we can do it. You can depend on it.
The campaign takes place in the living room now.
Not on the street.
Not on the street. And we're not interested in public speaking. We're interested in private speaking. I think that people know much more about candidates today than they did in the past.
And the commercials have been able to accomplish that education?
I think they're an important part of it. You know, people will say that, why can't we use the news and the discussion shows and the free media? You find then that the candidate loses control of his own campaign. He goes with what the interest of the newscaster is. He has to have control of his campaign. If he has the proper balance of his paid media, of the media he determines about himself. And isn't that what free speech means?
With the use of political commercials, does the best man win or the most telegenic?
I don't think it's either. You know, people will come to me and say, are you sure you work for the right candidate? You're a very powerful person in this realm. And I say that's an undemocratic question. The right candidate is not for me to decide, it's for the voters to decide.
You and I as voters also have to decide what we think of political spots. I'm ambivalent myself. I don't buy the argument that they undermine democracy. In a way, they serve democracy by reaching more people in a single instant than a whistle-stop campaign ever could, or a speech on the stump. When William Jennings Bryan was running for president, his speeches sometimes lasted 3 hours. Imagine him trying that on a television audience that's come to expect fast, fast, fast relief. One thing to be said for political spots is that they enable candidates to choose their message on their terms. The politician is not left to the mercy of newspaper editors or television producers looking for that 10-second excerpt that fits the reporter's script. The fact is, candidates can say a lot in 30 seconds that they think a voter should know about them or their opponents, and I'm not worried that they'll carry the day. No spot has the last word. We have news reports, the opposition's campaign, other publications, and our own common sense against which to measure its claims. That's one reason viewers have learned to take much of what they see in commercials, political or otherwise, with a grain of salt. Even so, if political spots don't undermine democracy, they trivialize its conversation. They reduce issues to black and white. They're frequently vague, and they can be misleading, deliberately or unwittingly. That 1964 Daisy commercial, for example, was intended to make people think about the urgency of controlling nuclear weapons and to remind them of Lyndon Johnson's prudence. It wasn't meant to make you think Barry Goldwater wanted to blow up little children. Yet although Goldwater's name was never mentioned, that's how a lot of people interpreted the ad. Furthermore, the Daisy spot is a classic example of how emotional ads in politics can be irrelevant to government. Nuclear responsibility is an issue in every election. But in 1964, the issue that should have been debated openly and candidly was what were we going to do about Vietnam? It haunts me all this time later that Lyndon Johnson was portrayed as the peacemaker in that campaign and Barry Goldwater the warmonger, but it was LBJ who, after his re-election, committed the country to a long, bloody war in Vietnam that eventually we lost. If my memory is correct, we never touched on Vietnam in any of the political spots in 1964. Political advertising tends to be an expensive and amusing sideshow to the real business of government, one more diversion in the theater of entertainment we all now live in. So I come down believing we have to keep looking for alternatives to carry on the political conversation of America, using television because it's here to stay, but using it in a way that does justice to the ideas and serious purpose of the men and women who run, and to the responsibility of all of us who must weigh what they say and act on it. I'm Bill Moyers.
General, both parties talk about bringing down food prices. How do we know which party to believe?
Well, instead of asking what party will bring prices down, why not ask what party put prices up? Then vote for a change.
I want a chance to give back to you the security and the hopes for tomorrow that inflation is stealing from you. With your help, we can do it. You can depend on it.
Trust is leveling with the people before the election about what you're going to do after the election. It's not enough for anyone to say, trust me, trust must be earned.
This is a great country, but I think it could be a greater country. And this is a powerful country, but I think it could be a more powerful country.
This is your first vote. And years from now, I just hope you can all look back and say it was one of your best votes. Thank you.
This program has been brought to you by the people of Chevron, who have been helping to supply America's energy needs throughout the 20th century.